Scripture reading be taken from Nehemiah 4, verses 14 and 15. And I looked up and rose up and said unto the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the peoples, Be not ye afraid of them, remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, and your wives, and your houses. And it came to pass, when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, that we would return all of us to the wall, every one unto his work.
Good evening. It's good to see each of you here this evening. I want to thank Brother Howard for his prayer, especially making mention that we make application from these lessons. That is the primary purpose of this series that we're going through in the book of Nehemiah. It's not just from a historical perspective. I know some of us here kind of geek out on that kind of thing. You know, learning about the historical setting and the background of the book, and that's all well and good, but as Christians, we need to make sure we're making spiritual application for the lessons that we find contained therein. And that's what I want us to get from Nehemiah. It is such a practical book in nature. And if you remember a couple weeks ago, we noted in that chapters 4 through 6 of Nehemiah demonstrate a cycle of advance and setback for Nehemiah and the Hebrews. They would make some progress, and then there would be some opposition. And then they would make some more progress and more opposition. And this is because serving God will bring opposition. There's no way around it. If you are serving God the way in which you should, there will be opposition in your life. However, the opposition can come in different forms. It's not always going to look the same. It's not always going to come from the same source. We identified several varieties of opposition in chapter 4. The first being the anger of others that's used against us. And then when that doesn't work, the mockery and the ridicule that will follow. And then threats and intimidation. Discouragement and exhaustion from the work already performed. And all of this culminating into fear. Being afraid of serving anymore. Let us remember, the better we are at recognizing such tactics as these, the more readily prepared we're going to be able to work through them. When we see what's coming, we can be ready to face it. If we just sit back and wait for the opposition to present itself, we may not know how to handle the situation. And so the goal of this lesson is going to be to learn how we are to respond to such opposition. In Nehemiah 4, there wasn't just the problem, but there was the problem and what Nehemiah and the Jews, the Hebrews, did to solve the problem. And so we want to focus on that today. At the outset, I do want to say that when responding to opposition, there are different options from which we can choose. I did not say right options. I said there are several options. One of which, we can just run from it. We can just tuck tail and run and try to get as far away from the opposition, from the persecution that we can. We may be a little bit braver, and instead of just turning around and running away, we might try to dodge it or go around it. You know, maybe even taking ourselves out of the way of where we need to go in order to avoid it. We can try to work out a compromise. We can try to find some mutual ground, and thereby both sides being pleased with the outcome. Or we can meet it head on, and we can work through it. Numbers 1 and 2 on our list are typically our first response to opposition, isn't it? Where we're just going to run away from it. We don't want to face it. We're just going to turn tail, we're just going to run. Maybe we are brave enough to keep heading in the same direction, but we're going to play a really bad game of chicken with it. And we're going to get out of the way as soon as we can. And we're going to try to go around it. We're going to try to skirt the problem. And if those two options fail, well, maybe we can try to compromise. If I can't avoid it altogether, if I'm going to have to deal with it in some way, then maybe we can strike a bargain to where we're both happy. Option number 4, we tend to avoid at all costs because it demands the most out of us. It's usually the messiest, the hardest. But if we are going to be truly honest with ourselves, option 4, we can meet it head on and work through it, is usually the only biblical response to opposition. What we see in chapter 4, this was always Nehemiah's response. He always resolved within himself that whatever opposition came, no matter what form it took, he was going to meet it and he was going to overcome it. Now, there were varying aspects that play into that. Just as the opposition varies, so varies the ways in which we can overcome. Nehemiah demonstrates 4 different aspects in chapter 4, and that's going to be our focus of tonight. The first one being, they lifted their voices in prayer. When presented with opposition, they decided to pray. Let's read in Nehemiah 4, beginning in verse 4. This is Nehemiah. He says, "Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads, and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders." And then drop down to the first part of verse 9. He says, "Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God." When faced with opposition, our first inclination is to go on the offensive and strike back. That's our first response, is we want to strike harder than what we were struck with. Because maybe that will cause them to back off. Maybe it will overcome them altogether. But our first action should always be to pray. Not to react, but to take it to God. Prayer helps us remember the sovereignty of God. And yes, He is sovereign even over those who attack us. It is not just His children in which He has sovereignty, but it is over everything that He has created. All those who are made in His image. In prayer, we acknowledge our trust in God. Even if we're unclear regarding our path, even if we don't know where this is going, we still acknowledge trust in God. But I want to look at Nehemiah's prayer specifically in verses 4 and 5, because it seems rather harsh, wouldn't you say? The words in which he used, the manner in which he prayed. How do we reconcile this with what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44, when He said, "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." Now, does that sound like Nehemiah's prayer? Does that sound like the language in which he prayed when he says, "Turn their reproach on their own heads. Give it back to them, God. Give them as plunder to a land of captivity"? I want us to understand that Nehemiah was not the only one to pray so directly. Turn, if you will, over to Psalm, the 5th chapter. Keep your finger there in Nehemiah and flip over to Psalm chapter 5. There is a section of Psalms. They have been attributed different meanings based on their content. And there is a section of Psalms called the imprecatory Psalms. And many have struggled over the years with these. And this is not a study on those per se. But the imprecatory Psalms has very strong language in which the one doing the praying is calling for things similar to what Nehemiah prayed. I want you, God, to render to my enemies that which is due them. But look in Psalm 5, beginning in verse 9. The writer says, "For there is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is destruction. Their throat is an open tomb. They flatter with their tongue. Pronounce them guilty, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against you." And then turn over to Psalm 79. Psalm 79, beginning in verse 10. The writer says, "Why should the nations say, 'Where is their God?' Let there be known among the nations in our sight the avenging of the blood of your servants, which has been shed. Let the groaning of the prisoner come before you according to the greatness of your power. Preserve those who are appointed to die, and return to our neighbors sevenfold into their bosom their reproach, with which they have reproached you, O Lord." Strong language that we may have a hard time understanding the meaning behind. Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those who curse you, do good to those who hate you. I submit to you that the prayer that we read in Nehemiah 4, the ones we have looked at in the Psalms, are appropriate and acceptable. And there are 3 reasons why I believe we can believe this. First is, this is not a prayer for personal vengeance. It's not a prayer that Nehemiah is offering saying, let me get my pound of flesh. Let me give back to them what they have given to us. It was a plea for God to righteously judge those who were sinners. Any action taken would be on the part of God, not man. Nehemiah is praying for God to render to them what they are due as sinners. Should they turn and start following God, all well and good. But as long as they maintain the course they are on, Nehemiah says, please render to them that which they are due. The second reason is since these enemies that Nehemiah was facing were attempting to hinder God's work, it was a prayer that God would judge those who oppose His kingdom and His glory. Why should we want those who stand opposed to God remain in that position? Why would we want those who seek to do harm to the kingdom to be able to remain there and continue to do harm to the kingdom? Nehemiah is asking, move them out of the way so that we can carry on with what we're supposed to do. And the third reason that such a prayer as this is acceptable is to pray for God's work to be done demands that all work contrary be brought to nothing. This goes to the idea of compromise. We're all right with Satan having a foothold in the world and everything going on out there that there is. That's okay as long as we're left alone and we can live as we want to live. We're all right with that. If we are going to pray for God's work to flourish, for it to be seen to completion, then that infers that all other work that is opposed to that be disrupted. These works should not be allowed to stand. When Nehemiah prayed this prayer, it was so that God's work could be done, so that those who stand opposed may be judged for their opposition, so that God's kingdom may be strengthened. But when we think of such prayers, we must be cautious that within our hearts we are not filled with selfish motives or take personal delight in the destruction of our enemies. If you go through and you look at the imprecatory Psalms, what you will notice is they were always calling for God's justice, for God's action, because it was God that had been wronged. Not because I have been wronged. But in opposing me, as I strive to do the will of God, they are in turn opposing God. We take things much too personally in this life. I mentioned this morning in our lesson about meekness that it is not about us in this life, it is about God. That is why we must have that balance of spirit. When we tip to one extreme or the other, we are focusing on self. And so we must always be concerned with the furtherment of God's work and His kingdom. This was Nehemiah's first response against opposition. When it happened, he prayed. Nehemiah is a prayerful man. The very first thing he did in chapter 1, what was it? After learning about the state of things in Jerusalem, he prayed. When he was presented with an opportunity, what did he do? He prayed. And now that he is beset with opposition, what does he do? He prays. That should always be our first response. But after praying about it, they didn't just sit back and say, well, God's got this. We've given it to Him. And that's all we can do. We can't do any more than God. No, they put their hearts into the work set before them. Look in Nehemiah chapter 4 and in verse 6. It's recorded, so we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. After this first and second round of opposition, after the mocking and the ridicule and now the threats and the intimidation are starting to present themselves, Nehemiah could have said, I didn't sign up for this. This is not what I was expecting. I've traveled how many hundreds of miles from a very comfortable position in the palace to oversee this effort. And we are being met with nothing but opposition and those who seek to make us stop working. This isn't what I want. But the people were willing. And Nehemiah wanted to facilitate that willingness. You know, in the not too different past, a very different mindset was present among God's people. In Ezra chapter 1, the first group of exiles returned to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel by the authority of King Cyrus of Persia. This is kind of where all this rebuilding started. In chapter 3 through chapter 4 and verse 5 of Ezra, we see the foundation of the temple was laid. They had rebuilt the base, and the plan was to continue with the rebuilding process. But what we see is also in chapter 4, verses 6 through 16, that there were letters written to the Persian kings by the opposition. Because even so many years before, there were people that still didn't want to see God's people restored. There were those opposed to the work. And so these malcontents wrote to the kings of Persia, and they misrepresented the intentions of God's people. They said, these people, once they have their city rebuilt, their idea is to just cut off all ties with you. They're not going to pay their taxes anymore. They're not going to still be subservient to you. That wasn't the plan. Nobody had ever said that among God's people. The plan was, let's rebuild God's city. But based on these misrepresentations, the king's reply in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 21, he said, now give the command to make these men cease. that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. And the next verse shows us that this command or this word from the king was carried out through force. Once the opposition got the support of the king, they said, we will handle this however we see fit. And so they took up arms and by force stopped the children of God from working. And we see that in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 24 when we're told that thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased. And it was discontinued until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. The Hebrews were pressured into stalling. They had laid the base. They had the blessing of the king to do what they were doing. But when the opposition persisted, they were stalled. Fast forward now a couple generations or so to the time of Nehemiah. Actually, not even that much. But now we're back in Jerusalem with the rebuilding process having been jump-started, and now the people had a mind to work. They were willing to look at the opposition and say, we're going to keep going. There was no waiting around to see if any official word would come. God's people did not set down their tools and just sit down on the ground and say, you know what, we're just going to wait and see if we have a word from the king on this. You remember what happened last time? The king sent word which was delivered through arms. Maybe we ought to just sit back and wait. They didn't do that. They didn't stop to wrangle with their accusers either. That would have been a victory for them, for the accusers. If they could get the children of Israel to stop, then they've won. But Israel did not take the bait, so to speak. They did not chase after their accusers and try to justify their actions and try to prove this is why we're doing what we're doing. They said, we know we're serving God. We don't need your approval in this matter. We're going to keep doing it. Opposition will always present opportunities to stop. We think that Satan's goal is to convince everyone to spit on the name of God. That's not his ultimate goal. If he can get you to that point, he's got his hooks in you deeper. But that's not what he's looking for out of everybody. If he can just cause God's people to stall in their service, he still wins. All he needs is unfaithful Christians, and he wins. He doesn't need a room full of atheists who deny the existence of God. He just needs those who aren't willing to do anything for him. Israel had a mind to work. They devoted themselves to God's service, and we must devote ourselves to the same service. We may not be rebuilding a physical city. We may not be clearing out rubble and stacking blocks, but we have a job to do as God's people. And it is our responsibility to put our hearts into it. But they did not do so blindly. They watched the enemy closely. In Nehemiah chapter 4, look at the second part of verse 9. We're going to read a couple sections here. In verse 9 it says, we'll just start at the beginning. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them, the enemies, the opposition, we set a watch against them day and night. Drop down to verse 16. So it was from that time on that half the servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor, and the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other held a weapon. Down to verse 22. At the same time, I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing. What we have to understand is that prayer, which is where we started with this lesson, it is not a magic cure-all. Does it mean that God is not listening if the prayer is not answered in the way we think it should be? No, it does not. Does it mean that God has answered? No, not necessarily. Prayer is often understood like this in our minds. We pray for deliverance. We are beset with opposition, with persecution, and we pray for God to deliver us. And then we put blinders on. And we resolve within ourselves that God will provide. I don't have to see what's going on. God's going to take care of it. He's got this. I've given it to Him. And then when our prayer isn't answered in the manner we think it should be, with our blinders on over here, we blame God for it. And we say, you didn't answer my prayer. The reality of the matter could be this: God did provide an answer, but we didn't see it because we weren't looking. We had our heads down, we had our blinders on, and we didn't see the deliverance God was offering us. Because we already had it in our mind how He was going to deliver us, and so we didn't need to look for anything else. Nehemiah did not turn his back to the enemy. He kept watch over them. He had prayed for God's righteous judgment and deliverance, but he also understood that he had a responsibility to be aware of what was going on. Perhaps God would answer Nehemiah's prayer through Nehemiah himself. And I think if you read chapter 4, you will see that that's the case. It was Nehemiah that provided much of the answers for Israel in the face of their opposition. If Nehemiah had said, I give it to God and He's going to do it, and then not been aware of what was going on, do you think they would have been delivered in the same way? If a physical threat was imminent, would you not be on guard? Would you not be watching out? In September of last year, it was reported that a tiger had escaped from the zoo down in Knoxville. There was an off-duty deputy. He was working a second job as security for a warehousing company. And he saw what he called a large cat come out of the bushes and run across and go into some more bushes, and apparently concluded that it was a tiger. Now, to my knowledge, no one's ever found this tiger. But the zoo, they were kind of blamed for it. You know, it was a tiger, so it must come from the zoo, was the conclusion. So they got all the tigers together, they had a roll call, and they determined it's not one of ours. Everyone is present and accounted for. But if you lived in the vicinity of where this occurred, you know, the deputy was working half a mile from where you live. And he said, I saw a tiger on the loose. And the zoo says, well, it's not our tiger. He said, I saw a tiger. How are you going to respond to that? Are you going to go outside as if everything was normal? Are you going to walk out to your car that's in your own driveway, not 20 feet from your front door, without maybe taking a step outside and just kind of giving a look around? You know, maybe say, here, kitty, kitty, and see if anything pops out? Would you act as if everything was the same? If the kids are wanting to go outside and play, sure, go on out there. If you see a tiger, just make sure you can run faster than your sister. We wouldn't act like that when a physical threat was imminent. We would take precautions. We would be vigilant when we had to go outside to make sure we weren't caught off guard by this loose roaming tiger. Nehemiah saw the threat and he took precautions. He saw the threat that these enemies were presenting, and he said, I have to prepare for it. Brethren, we get too comfortable in our own skin when the threat is not physical. We all shake our heads in agreement that we would prepare if we heard there was a tiger loose outside. But I want to read to you what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. He said, be sober, be vigilant, be prepared, be looking, because your adversary, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. We all say, oh yeah, if I heard there was a tiger on the loose, I would be prepared and I would pay attention. But God says there's a roaring lion looking for us every single day of our lives, and many of us act like he's not there at all. Many of us go about our lives as if he doesn't exist. It is a very real threat. Greater than any physical threat we could endure, because this threat has eternal consequences. Not physical, but eternal. I want you to notice the precautions that Nehemiah took in the face of a physical threat. It says that people were positioned where they were needed. He said, I want you to go here, I want you to go here and here. He laid them out right where they needed to be. Some built while others defended. Some were dressed in battle array, holding their weapons at their side, guarding and protecting those who were building. Question: can everyone build at the same time and no one be watching for the enemy? No. Flip it. Can everyone be sitting back, ready for battle, pulling their duty on guard while no building is taking place? If everybody had picked up a spear or a bow and set back for Israel saying, I will guard the perimeter, there wouldn't have been a perimeter to guard. The building would have stalled. They also took it very seriously to the point where they took no time for leisure. They didn't punch out at the end of the day. Come back to their home or their tent, whatever they're staying in, kick off their sandals and sit down and say, that was a good day's work. Nehemiah said there was a large contingency of them that stayed within the city, and it was an around-the-clock system to where he said we didn't even take off our clothes except to wash them. They were always ready. When you leave here tonight, after services is concluded, are you going to punch out as you walk out the door? Are you going to say, I've done my Christian duty, I came here twice today. I've given up an entire Saturday. I could have been in my garden, I could have been out on the lake, I could have been watching something on TV, but instead I came here. I've done my duty, punched the clock, I'll see you on Wednesday. We have to be continually on guard because the enemy is continually looking for ways in which he can get at us. Satan doesn't stop. Why do we think we can? He is not going to stop coming for your soul. You have to be constantly guarding it. They were working while they were armed. They held a weapon in one hand and they worked with the other hand. They may have been able to get more done had they put the bow down and worked with two hands, but they were ready. They were prepared. Should the enemy attack, we are already mustered. Working while armed. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Working while armed. Paul would write to the Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 20, he writes to Christians there. Guess what? That's you and me. Christians. To dress in the full armor of God, from head to toe. Why? In order to stand against the devil. That roaring lion that is seeking to devour us, Paul admonishes Christians to be prepared by wearing the full armor of God. Yet many of us are content to go outside spiritually naked. We're okay with going outside unprepared, unprotected, and we think we're going to be okay. I want you to listen to me closely. Keeping our eyes on the enemy does not require us letting him into our lives. We don't have to become buddy-buddy with him in order to see what he's up to. Nehemiah did not invite his enemies into the camp and say, we really want to keep an eye on you. No, he watched them what they were doing, but he didn't let it distract him from what he was doing. He didn't get so close to them that they began to rub off on him, influence him. And yet we go through this world day after day after day, surrounded by the filth and the immorality that exists, unprotected. And we think we're going to come home at the end of the day stronger spiritually than when we started. We have to be dressed in the armor of God at all times. And we have to keep our eye on what the enemy is doing. Nehemiah and the Hebrews responded to the enemy's opposition by first lifting their voices in prayer and then putting their hearts into the work, closely watching the enemy. But lastly, we see that they kept their minds focused on God. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 14. He says, "And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." The Hebrews were being distracted. They really were, and it's easy for us to see why. I mean, the threats of the opposition had gotten into their heads. They were starting to think about this and see that, matched in a battle, they didn't really stand a chance. And so it was starting to affect their way of thinking. And besides that, they would look around Jerusalem already upset because of the opposition, and they just, man, we've still got so much of this wall to rebuild. We have so much rubble we still have to haul away. The work seemed to be never ending. There's so much to do. And Nehemiah recognized what was happening. The people were losing their focus on God. They were being consumed with what was around them and not on who was above them. Reminds me of Peter, right? Walking on the water. What a miraculous feat. I've often wondered what it looked like, what it felt like to be able to walk on water. Was it soft and pillowy? Did he sink in just a little bit, kind of like sand? But here he is stepping out of a boat in a storm, walking towards Jesus on the water. And what does the Scripture tell us happened? He saw the storm around him. He saw all the commotion. And he became inadequate in his own eyes. Absolutely in his own eyes he would. Peter would not be able to do that of his own accord. it was through the power of Jesus, but he lost focus. Jesus was right in front of him, and yet he began to sink. Nehemiah brings the focus of the people back to where it needs to be. He says, remember the Lord, great and awesome. And I want us to note the result of focusing on God. It's not you're going to be okay. It's not all about us. But Nehemiah says, fight for your brethren. Fight for your family and home. That was the emphasis. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your houses. No mention of them individually in there. When we begin focusing on the Lord, it takes the focus off of self. When we focus on God, we are no longer focusing on ourselves. And Nehemiah says, as you focus on God, you will be able to fight for all those around you, all those that you love. It's not about you anymore, it's about God. Opposition seeks to make us look at what we have to lose. What is the risk for me in this situation? I believe a better mindset is, what will God lose if we let opposition overtake us? And I don't want anybody to sit back and say, well, God doesn't need anything from me. He's God after all. What could He possibly need from little old me? True Christianity is proclaimed both through words and actions. What God needs from us is for us to be focused on Him. Because when we are focused on Him, we are going to live as Christians should live. We are going to proclaim the gospel which saves. Because that is the focus. Not ourselves. Paul would give the admonition in Colossians 3 and verse 2. He says, set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth. And there are times when we must stop and when we must stop and reconfigure our mindset. Set your mind on things above, and sometimes we get pulled away. We let ourselves be dragged away from the things which are above, and we have to reset, and we have to say, I am not focused on what I need to be focused on. I need to look at those things which are above, not on the things which are around me. Just as the cumulative effect of opposition is fear. That is the end result, is fear. The cumulative response that we have must be staying focused on God. That's the only way we're going to be able to overcome opposition. These other three aspects we looked at all come from that focus on God. Praying to Him, taking it to Him. Setting our minds to the work. Keeping our eyes on the enemy. That's because we are focused on the one in which we are serving. In the 4th chapter of Nehemiah, we see a great deal of opposition to faithful service. It's just one thing right after another. And this is not unique to Nehemiah. Nehemiah is not the only one that faces this opposition. Serving God will be met by those who oppose it. Good and bad, right and wrong, light and darkness, however you want to describe it, are all completely opposed to each other. They cannot exist simultaneously. You cannot have good and evil reside within the same entity. It cannot happen. But with this opposition, what we see are the means of responding to it. We are not left alone to figure it out ourselves. We are not left alone to make our own decisions in the matter. God has done that for us, and He demonstrates from Genesis through Revelation how we can do that. Instead of succumbing to the resistance, let us meet it head on and overcome it with the strength of God. Even with all this opposition that they faced, Nehemiah was still able to say in chapter 4 and verse 21, "So we labored in the work." They didn't give up. They didn't let the opposition overcome them. May the same be said of us. That although all these things were going on, all these negative influences kept trying to break down our defenses, we labored in the work. Nehemiah knew that their deliverance was going to come from God no matter what happened. No matter what shape that deliverance took, Nehemiah was confident it was going to come from God. In chapter 4 and verse 15, he says that God had brought their enemies' plans to nothing. When they had tried to plan to overthrow them and overtake them, it was God, Nehemiah says, that brought that to nothing. In verse 20, he says that if a physical altercation was needed, if it did come to blows, Nehemiah was confident that God would fight for them. Now, fortunately, that never had to be proved in this case. But Nehemiah was confident. But even though he knew this, Nehemiah was still expected to act in accordance with God's will. He attributed their success to God each and every time. But he did not sit back and do nothing. Why do we think the same, or that we'll be able to do that when it comes to our salvation? Our deliverance comes from the hand of God. It is He that makes us clean. It is He who removes our sins. In Colossians 2, a spiritual circumcision takes place in baptism that removes that old man. And we come out of the water a new creature. We are expected, just like Nehemiah was, we are expected to act in accordance with God's will. We cannot sit back and say, God, you do everything. I love you, I acknowledge you, I know you are the creator of all, and you're able to save me. God's looking down at those individuals saying, yes, I can. But why won't you have faith in me to do what I ask? We talk about the steps a lot, or the physical steps that we take. But I want to spend just a moment talking about the condition of the heart, because that is where it all begins. I'm sure at some point in our lives, all of us have had a bath, right? Whether just as an infant or another situation, we've all had a bath. We've all been in a pool at some time or another, went swimming in the creek. You know, you name it. We've all been in water before. Does that mean we were baptized? It does not. Just because we went into the water does not mean our heart was right. There may be some here tonight that have even said, well, yeah, I've done all that, but I've also been baptized once upon a time. What was the condition of your heart? Were you doing it for the right reasons? Why God says we must be baptized? Or were you doing it because a man said, this is why you're baptized? See, I never want anybody to take my word for it. I make a lot of mistakes. And I never want to be the end all, especially when it comes to someone's spiritual condition. What does God say in the matter? A man has to be born again. Doesn't matter what age you are, you can be born again, because it's not physical, it's spiritual. It's being born of water through baptism in the Spirit, God working in that act that renders us clean. Do you need that in your life today? Do you need to be clean spiritually? Are you ready to take up the armor of God? It's a fight every day. Armor is heavy. Physical armor is. Weighs many pounds. This isn't that heavy to carry around. And as long as you stay in this book, as long as this is where you get your guidance from, you are going to be covered with that armor. And you are going to be protected from that lion that is seeking to devour you. But you can't do that outside the body of Christ. And so we invite you in tonight. If you are not a Christian and you realize that at this moment, right now, you need to become one, we ask you to act on that. If you are a Christian that has sin in your life, you would like prayers for forgiveness and for strength going forward, allow us to pray with you and for you to that end. We want each person to leave here tonight confident of their standing with God. Confident that should time end tonight, they know they will be taken to an eternal rest. If we can help you in any way tonight, won't you let us know by coming forward as together we stand and sing.